Okay, we are recording. Cool. So, welcome everybody. We are back at it again in the midst of some quarantine. My name is Adam Cross,
I'm Daniel Johnson.
and yeah, we are talking about some more good stuff today in the realm of Catholicism and therapy, combining those two worlds. So, yeah. So I thought we could talk a little bit about masculinity. And that's a pretty broad topic, but maybe also a kind of a controversial one these past couple of years. Um, but mostly because I am running, or I'm beginning to run, a disciple group for young guys at our parish. So it's not a therapy group; it's ministry based. Um, and really, I think what came to mind when I started thinking about this group was, what do I want guys to know about masculinity? And it really started out kind of difficult for me. I was like, where do I begin? Like, where do I begin with a group of guys in forming that community, but also focusing in on masculinity? It's kind of hard. And I think,
Yes, it's very hard.
yeah, nowadays it's harder.
Yeah, and so there's this easy dichotomy you could build between kind of stereotypical 1950s masculinity, which is kind of the bugaboo of the left, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's you could which has all of its exaggerations with it. So I think people are right to find a degree to object to that kind of caricature is probably of masculinity. But at the same time, once we've kind of jettisoned that model, um, we're left with no guideposts, nothing
Mm-hmm.
specific, nothing to concretely use to kind of guide men in
Mm-hmm.
being who and what they are.
Yeah.
And maybe it starts off with, maybe the right place to start off with is the question, um, what makes men different than
Mm-hmm.
women, I guess, is part of that question. But also, even before that, there's the question of just what makes a good person.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
does the answer to that, what makes a good person, is that somehow specified or differentiated by the genders in any meaningful way? And you're right, it's a hard question, principally because we've jettisoned whatever model we have, and now we have no way to guide us
Mm-hmm.
in answering that question.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean that's the first problem I see, is there's just no guidepost.
Yeah. And I started off just looking up some videos on YouTube on masculinity from a Catholic perspective. I got some interesting results. One of them, well, I guess I'll start with a non-Catholic one. One, I just typed in toxic masculinity for the fun of it. And I found a video that, it, like you're saying, it's talking about all the forms of toxic masculinity there are, right? Violence, aggression, like a need for dominance, inability to show weakness or show emotion. So, like, yes, those things don't make a good man, right? But the video also never talked about what masculinity actually was. It was just saying these are all these components of the toxic masculinity, but it never pointed into a correct version, right? It was just kind of like, maybe just be more feminine, or maybe just be more emotional. But I
but
thought
but
that
that's
was,
implied.
yeah,
That's never, there's no clear statement, there's no specific structure given. Yeah.
yeah. And as you mentioned, like, one of the videos I found was Father Mike Schmitz did a men's conference. I think it was in Virginia for a diocese, and I didn't watch the entire thing, but the main thing he started off with was that as men, we typically, usually, are thinking about where else we could be and something else we could be doing. And his whole thing was starting off with the first step in embracing our masculinity is really living in the present moment and taking up the responsibilities we have at hand, which I was like, wow. And that going back to, just being a better person, right? Being who we are supposed to be in this given moment. It almost sounds too simple in the context of masculinity, but then to really think about it, and like you said, to think about how the genders really display that and express that responsibility and that role of even being in the present moment. I thought was a really interesting take.
No, it strikes me that there's some wisdom there. The question perhaps is less about how do I conform to this model or this ideal of masculinity. And the question is more about how do I sort of incarnate truth, beauty, and goodness in the present moment, given who and what I am. And that incarnation is going to be specified not only because I'm an individual, but also in some generic ways based upon my gender, or as a consequence of my gender. So the typically there, I would speculate that there's going to be some general characteristics of how a man is good, or how a man witnesses to truth or expresses beauty in a way that's different, generally speaking, than the way women express those things. And I'm still kind of in the abstract at this point, and I'm having difficulty though bringing this down into a very concrete level. Kind of beginning once again to construct a new model to help conform myself.
And it is hard with taking into account our brokenness and original sin. I mean, I think part of the masculine nature is to go, right, to begin building and even creating. And I think that's in the image and likeness of God. What that looks like though is kind of confusing, because right, Adam and Eve fell, and Adam has to toil and work and labor in what could be really, really good, now becomes something that is somewhat of a burden, something that is more difficult. But I think in using Christ as that model, as this redeemed Adam, that we are called to go, we are called to build in a very specific way, maybe. And maybe that's something to explore more, but that, there is something different between men and women, where men are called to go forth and to build and to protect and care for. And I've been reading C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet space trilogy, which is really good. And the second book, Paralandra, I don't want to do too many spoilers, but at the end of the book, you really get this image from C.S. Lewis of what man is supposed to look like if he hadn't fallen into sin. And it really is this image of a king, and a king that has a role and a responsibility to care, protect, and I'd say build up the kingdom, which I really love. If anybody hasn't read that book, it's awesome. It's called Paralandra, but it really shows at least C.S. Lewis's version of what redeemed man or never fallen man should have looked like.
No, you begin to hit on perhaps the way, perhaps the only way to begin to build a kind of template or model of masculinity, and that would be to have reference to the scriptural examples. So Adam, we could certainly draw similar characteristics from Abraham, from the various judges and prophets, King David, Solomon, but par excellence, of course, is the new Adam, the real King, Christ himself. And there is this going out of his place and creating something which is characteristic of all of these characters. And so there's probably an essential dynamic to men going out of their place and creating something or being part
Mhm.
of a kind of co-creative experience. So of course you have Adam is drawn out of the ground. You have
Mhm.
Abraham who is drawn out of his father's house. You have David drawn out of his father's house, and it takes a while to find him, but eventually he gets
Mhm.
drawn out of the house. You know, we have to
Yeah.
go to the next valley or whatever and get through the other 6 kids, but we eventually draw him out of his father's house. Um, and it's interesting that even our Lord, who, you know, he left his place. What's the phrase in Hebrews? You know, he did not grasp at equality with God, or he did
Mhm.
not count equality with God something to be grasped at, but rather
Yeah.
humbled himself and took the form of a man. Yeah, he left his place in
Mhm.
heaven and became incarnated. But what is more is he left his household as well to go out and gather the disciples.
Yeah.
And then you know, and then he returns ultimately, which is kind of maybe another element to this,
Mhm.
dare we say, masculine spirituality. This first
Yeah.
leaving of your place, and then relying on your resources, your virtues, your habits, your characteristics, your spirituality to engage in creation, to
Mhm.
um, you know, and then you brought up those other characteristics, the protection,
Yeah.
the caring for, and those kind of become natural extensions of leaving your place. You gather around
Mhm.
yourself certain people that you have to care for. Abraham had, you know, his brother's household and
Mhm.
a whole household of a village practically following him around, to say nothing
Yeah.
of the kind of care that David or any of the judges have of the people. Not only are they going out of their place, but they are engaging with people in the new place to help them conform to the image of God, to the experience of God.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. And you have Christ as the bridegroom and the church as the bride. And right, St. Paul calls men to die for their wives, die for, those they loved. And yeah, so kind of this leading up to Christ as this example of masculinity. Um, and I think we can get stuck because society right now, in a lot of ways, is really objecting to any type of traditional um, gender roles, right? If it looks anything like classical masculinity, it's even if it's not toxic, I think it's thrown away. Even and same thing with femininity, right? Like there is toxic masculinity. There's aspects of masculine, or there is wrongly lived masculinity that is toxic, but there are parts that we do need to reassess and embrace, right? Like there is a kingship that is a part of masculinity that is really essential to who we were made to be, right? I mean, we've fallen, but we are called to be kings in that, in sharing in that with Christ. Um, but it's hard because a lot of people look at that as exclusionary to queenship or to non-kingship.
right.
Um,
No, it's
that's
this
yeah.
fallacy that if
Mhm.
there's a difference, therefore it's impossible to have some kind of equality. You know, if
Yeah.
there's any sort of distinction, and you follow that as far as you can, you know, then you know even you and I, who are, you know, straight white males, we can't possibly be equal or the same
Mhm.
because we're on at least some level we have a distinction, you know, and it
Yeah.
gets kind of absurd. Whereas, you know, all things being equal, you and I, you know, broadly speaking, have a pretty similar experience. You know, we have
Mhm.
some content which is different. I went to seminary. I don't think you did.
Yeah.
You know, you're married, I'm not, but so there are some distinctions there. But no,
Yeah.
it's yeah, and that's kind of the one of the dangers with this question is or one of the difficulties with this question is what we are talking about is very much in the broad and in the abstract. You know,
Mhm.
um, Aristotle had this common phrase, you know, uh, ethics is about things that happen always or for the most part. You know, usually this is the case, but there's going to be exceptions, and no place is that more true than when you try to categorize human beings. But yeah, looking to the scriptural models, and then that notion of going out and co-creating, but that doesn't mean that women are any less co-creators. I mean, I mean, it's quite obvious that in a much more literal sense than women are co-creators. I mean, we're tenders of a garden. Women, I mean, yeah, you know, that women have a much more intimate role in the act of creation than men do.
Yeah. Yes, physically creating and giving of themselves. I mean, you can't get much more creative than that.
No, and I mean, you know, at the risk of descending too far into the concrete here, I mean, man's act of co-creation is, again, a going out of himself and into another place, at which creation takes place. A kind of co-creation takes place within a woman. And maybe that's as concrete as we need to get. But, you know, even on the biological level, there's this man's co-creation takes place, you know, outside of himself or outside of his place.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it doesn't happen within us.
No,
on that same level.
And just as Abraham has to leave his father's house, so too, you know, creation takes place. You know, the creation of the family in a physical sense takes place within a woman, a different place than the man. So it's
and I think,
well, it's interesting. I mean, and I've read attachment theory books that try to understand the difference between men and women, precisely from that, starting with that as a perspective. You know, testosterone, which is the major biological difference between men and women, causes things to go out of men. You know, I mean, you know, gonads are gonads until you have testosterone, and then they go outside of you. So, but no, it's an interesting thing. And then that testosterone kicks in teenage years, and that's when boys get unruly and punch walls and go outside of themselves. So yeah, there's this, even on the biological level. I think this is a really important dynamic to understand, that, you know, whether it's physical, as, you know, while we're gestating, or while we're procreating, or while we're talking about our spirituality, there is this dynamic of leaving your place and going out into creation to build something.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that, right, with Jesus building the church and giving himself for the church, and even just the apostles, right? The apostles being sent in that same way to build this church, not only physically but spiritually. And yeah, I'm also reading it right now, Leisure, the Basis of Society by Joseph Piper.
Culture.
He's German.
The basis of culture.
Oh, sorry, it's culture. That's right. Yeah. And it's interesting because he's definitely reminding me in this book that man is not just physical, right? We don't buy into the scientism that there's only the physical, but man is also not just spiritual, right? That we are both, right? Body and soul, right? And kind of that meeting point of the mind too. And I think it's easy for society nowadays to look at the physical and say, like, oh, well, what can we do to be a man? Let's just check off those boxes, right? Like, oh, do I need these parts? Well, modern science can make that happen, debatably. But there's also this spiritual, and even just, like you said, that more abstract side of masculinity that we might try to avoid, right? It's easy to try to check off those boxes, right? Like, I'm going to buy a car. I'm a man, right? I'm going to, I don't know, whatever it is, whatever that rite of passage is, which can be really good things, but it's also more than just that physical action. There's an essence to this masculinity that can't be, what's a good word? Can't be as transferred or as imitated, I would say. It can to an extent, but it's not it's not going to be fully grasped or imitated if it's not really a part of that person. And that's a whole nother controversial topic.
Well, it is, but it's also very much a living part of the conversation right now surrounding the debate of transgenderism is that, okay, you got your parts, you know, you bought your upgrade, but you didn't go through the trials that teenage boys go through. You didn't go through learning how to relate to opposite gendered parents the way we do. You didn't go through the bullying. You didn't go through the kind of hierarchical exchange that men have. You know, that is a serious part of the debate, is really how feminine can these people be, or how masculine can they be if they didn't go through the concomitant psychological development that is unique to masculinity or femininity, to say nothing of the spiritual development. I mean, I don't think it's a well, and it's just an observation. I don't quite know how to articulate this as a set of rules, but the spirituality of men and women is also different, and that's something which people. But it's just an observation at this point. But so no, I mean that's a very real objection to this whole process or this whole ideology.
Yeah, and the question is, you know, how does it feel to be a man? I mean, first of all, men can only guess at that because we all have
and that's my observation with
themes.
This whole thing. I mean, I don't know what it means to feel to be a man. You know, and I don't know what that. It doesn't strike me as one of the things about which I feel. You know, I feel angry, I feel sad, I don't feel man or woman, you know? I mean,
yes. And that's one of the common critiques of transgenderism versus modern feminism, right? To feel like a woman is to completely minimize femininity to feelings, right? If a man says, well, I feel like a woman, well, then he's put all of, you know, womanhood in a tiny little box that he can feel. And I think the same thing goes for masculinity, that maybe we don't talk about it in the same way, right? Because meninism is very controversial to look down on, right? But there is an aspect of looking at that side and say, what does it feel like to be a man? Which, is there's themes. There might be some rites of passage, but not easily as definable. So I think the other part of this conversation too is, you know, we're not looking at necessarily what do I do to become a man, but how can we live out our masculinity in maybe some practical ways, still considering the spiritual and just even the essence of it. How can we live out our masculinity? What do you think?
Right. And see, it's an interesting question because while you separate off the rites of passage or the developments into manhood, I think what's important about those is that those often instruct boys how to live out their masculinity. So, I mean, the you know, getting married and having a family, for example, comes with it a whole host of attitudes and behaviors that are required to make that a healthy, functioning thing in society, all of which is living out one's masculinity. So too with, you know, entering the workplace, you know, in order to be a good worker, to say nothing of a good entrepreneur, you have this whole host of virtues and skills that you have to draw on in order to do that well. And I think probably, you know, there are certainly two ways of looking at this. You could look at the goal, you know, what does it mean to be a man? But you could look at the process of getting to that goal as well. And done right, the process teaches all of this. But to answer the discrete question, you know, how do we live out our masculinity? It seems to me that the degree to which we are caring for others, whether that's as a boss, as a father, as a spiritual leader, a coach, a teacher, some kind of what is
Yeah.
contemporarily called an allo parent. I think the degree to which we are caring for others, and this fits,
Yeah.
not that he was making gender distinctions, but Erickson's final stage, right? Take all of those stages involve some kind of caring for others, some
Mm,
kind of providing to the next generation. Although I don't think he would make gender distinctions with that kind of development, but
mhm.
so that to me is at least one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is, how are you caring for others? How are you
Mhm.
providing and helping all of these other people conform to the divine image? That
Yeah.
strikes me as a place to start. I don't know if that's
Yeah.
sufficient, but
No, I think that's, yeah, as I would say a general theme, that's spot on, right? When we're talking about um, Adam and Christ and this call to care and kind of pick up this role and responsibility, and that might be where Father Mike is getting to, um, really to say that wherever we are, right, that our call is to do what we're doing well, right? Even if it is to, in a moment, listen or to be present. And I think for me as a teen and young adult, this answer would have been really dissatisfying. It's like, okay, but what do I do? It's like, okay, I'd be responsible, but what do I do? Um, and that, I think that's hard for guys, especially because it's like, okay, but if I just do something, like, can we break it down? But so I think what I'm hearing is
well,
that
on one
call for
level,
responsibility.
yeah, I mean, on one level, what do? I mean, you get a job and you
Yeah.
finish your schoolwork and you take care of your mom and dad, or
Hmm.
your wife and kids. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, does it need to be more specific than that? Perhaps.
Yeah.
Well, yes, of course it does.
Mm.
But the problem with a conversation like this versus a conversation I would have with a client, or a life coach client or something, is I can get specific about,
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
know, their wife and their kids, or their music career versus their carpentry career, or whatever.
Hmm.
You can get more specific like that. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the broad question is, well, and you point out that the problem for you would have been as a teenager,
Hmm.
and I've brought this up a couple other times in the course of our conversations, but it seems to me that we have, as a society, so tremendously delayed the rites of passage, as you say,
Hmm.
such that teenagers are rightly frustrated. I
Yeah.
think they are, because their entrance into adulthood has been delayed, unnecessarily
Yeah.
delayed.
Almost double.
I mean, and I brought this example up before. I
Yeah.
mean, Johnny Tremaine was, as a 14-year-old, he was in the
Hmm.
same position most 32-year-olds finally are in.
Yeah.
He's about to get married and inherit a family business.
Yeah.
Um, and he was taking
Yeah.
care of himself and other people.
Absolutely.
So
Right. The biological side of it is, it solves a lot of our present day problems, right? But yeah, no, I think it's true, and yeah, it is. So I totally lost my train of thought. I saw some guy
no,
walking
I
outside.
mean, and well, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I think teenagers are denied a psychologically necessary uh,
Yeah,
responsibility, psychologically necessary role. And it's an
yeah,
interesting thing. We've almost front loaded the life of leisure into people's
hmm,
first 20 years of their life. I mean, the kind of meditation and the kind of discipline it takes to be a good student,
hmm,
was typically reserved to, people in their 30s and 40s, or people, at the end of
hmm,
their life would have the opportunity to become wise men.
yeah.
Instead, for some reason, we've taken the first
Crammed it in there.
23 years of a person's life and said, hey, no responsibilities, go read and write some interesting papers, and don't
Yeah.
get in trouble on social media, and you'll be fine.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
by doing that, we've really retarded, in the literal sense of the term, we've slowed down people's ability to, engage with other people, become responsible adults, provide for other people, take on
Mm-hmm.
a burden that is useful to yourself and to others. And we've collapsed it into this premature life of leisure for these kids.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. And I think these rites of passage, right, they come with a level of responsibility that maybe we have kind of dumbed down a lot, where it's just like, oh, here's a new toy, or here's something, you can say you've done, but that these rights are important in the sense, the essence of the matter is you're taking that responsibility on, you're caring for that. And that's a big part of it, and something I think we have lost. So kind of going back to that general, masculinity is living in the present moment and really taking responsibility for the task at hand. And I think part of that is life in general. We have a lot of tasks that are given to us just by life, right? By circumstances, by family, by calls. It's not, to be a man isn't to go out and find your own task and make our own way, but part of it is to accept what we are given and to do that well. Right? I know Jordan Peterson talks a lot about that, and just even waking up and making our bed, right? That
Mm-hmm.
little action, how that can, ripple effects into taking that accountability, I think is huge. So it's taking that responsibility in the present moment that can really shape our masculinity. And as we're talking about that spirituality, the essence of masculinity, we can't always put it into words. Sometimes it is there, especially when we're taking those actions. That's pretty abstract, but I think it's the essence is there.
Well, and you and I have been struggling this whole conversation between the abstract and the practical.
Yeah.
And one barrier to the practical is that we really do need to know all the individual details of a person's life.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, Jordan Peterson does ask the exact right question. Take a minute after you've made your bed, sit on your bed,
Mm-hmm.
and ask yourself what needs to be done.
Yeah.
And a whole host of things are going to pop into your mind very quickly. Everything from
Yeah.
cleaning the room to, building a Fortune 500 company. They're all going to come to mind. And,
Yeah.
you do the little bit you can today towards all of those goals, and you
Yeah.
rein in some of the chaos, to continue using his language, and you establish some order. And that's
Mm-hmm.
that's precisely the same image in the garden. I mean,
Yeah.
anybody who has taken on a garden knows it takes about 48 hours before chaos slips in there. Or
Yeah.
I was always fascinated by this. So Dante's Paradiso, Dante
Mm-hmm.
is flying through heaven and talking to folks along the way before he gets to go meet Our Lady and our Lord. And one of the people he talks to is Adam.
Mm-hmm.
And he has two questions for Adam. And one question is, what was the original name for God? What was the personal name you knew him by? And the other one was, how long did it take before the fall? And I've always been struck by this. It's 6 hours is the answer. It takes about 6 hours before chaos
Yeah.
enters your garden, and you got to deal with something.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was interesting, because our days are pretty well divided into 6-hour
Mm-hmm.
increments. Work is about that long. Our leisure on either end is about that long. Sleep is about that long. So it's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, my point is that, yeah, once you have this little corner of heaven in your life, you got to
Mm-hmm.
defend it and hopefully build on it. Whether that's your
Yeah.
family, your monastery, your 1-bedroom apartment, whatever it is that you have as kind of the physical expression of your masculinity. You got to defend it and build on it
Mm-hmm.
and perpetuate it and bring it more and more and more in line with the divine image.
Yeah. And I think, part of that image of the garden and Adam too is embracing that sonship, right? It's when we wake up and we make our bed and we think, what do I need to do today? we could be flooded. Um, but part of it is also inviting God into that, maybe the mess, maybe the weeds that are popping up, and saying, and having that level of discernment and openness to God, and say, okay, God, what am I called to do? And part of that sonship really is, like Christ on the cross, is that obedience and saying yes to God and asking him to help us figure out what we are doing. It's not just, sometimes we think discernment is, well, am I supposed to be a priest or am I supposed to get married? But I think it can and should be just a general openness to seeing how God is speaking to us. So part of that masculinity is just hearing God and making time for God and helping us within that list that can build up, and to get practical, to not just stay in there, but God actually helps us to be pretty practical when we're open, right? It
Oh,
does
and that's precisely the image. I mean, that's precisely the image in chapter 1 of Genesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Adam's not just tending the garden; he's having a
Yeah.
conversation.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's, when the fall happens, that's part of the imagery there. The conversation had stopped, and that's part of the struggle there. Part of the fall is that Adam cut himself off from that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And from the expression of that relationship through conversation.
Yeah.
So no, it's an important thing that, yes, it's not, I mean, Jordan Peterson, at the end of the day, he's the little way for seculars, right?
Yeah.
He's asking himself these questions, but he's not bringing God into
Mm-hmm.
he's not bringing a personal relationship with the divine
Yes.
into that dynamic. But you're precisely right. That's exactly what the Catholic spirituality is all about. Is you're having that contention with chaos and order, but that contention is personalized in the person of Christ, the Father, the Holy Spirit, contending against matter's natural propensity to fall apart. To cease to be. To move away from he who is, to disintegrate apart from the I am who am. And now I'm just getting, I'm mixing a little too much here, but hopefully, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, part of masculinity is that relationship with God, that we are reflecting a part of God that we can't always grasp at, right? Being a man is not wearing a tie, but it is a part of being a man, right? It's not having short hair, right? That's not the definition of masculinity, but it could be a part of it.
It won't be after this.
Yeah, yeah, no haircuts. So there is a part of masculinity that it can be frustrating, but that we can't grasp and put under a microscope, that our world often demands. And there is this spiritual aspect of having that relationship with God, who further reveals our relationship with ourselves as men. So kind of coming back to that relationship, that present moment, saying yes to God in the small things we do and taking up that responsibility. I think it's a beautiful way to look at masculinity. And it's not always practical. It's not always utilitarian, right? It's not always going to produce something for us, but reflecting God, being in the presence of God, and really getting to the core of that masculine parts of ourselves and God. That's worth looking at and worth reflecting and chewing more on. I like this. This is a good conversation. So
no, it is, and to the question of and maybe a good way to round this off is for your men's group, really kind of as practical as we can get. Maybe what are the 3 or the 5 essential parts of being a man. What does that look like concretely for people? And for me, it would be something like conforming to a regular schedule, something like daily prayer, and probably something along the lines of have I made some movement towards my long-term goals in my life, my business or my family or something like that.
Yeah.
efforts am I making to accomplish those things?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it's having that self-respect, that relationship with God and care for others in being able to build and
Yeah.
create. Yeah. That's good. And yeah, it is hard to get super practical unless we're talking to a specific person, right? Masculinity for an eighth grader is going to look different from a 10th grader, is going to look different from 25-year-old to, you know, any age. So, but yeah, those general themes cut across, and really looking, where is God in my life? Where is he calling me to go? And yeah, that's a really good start. Well, cool. This has been great. So yeah, maybe we kind of wrap it up here, and we'll see if anything comes from it. And if people have
Yeah.
comments on this, I would love to hear that, because this is such a broad spectrum, and especially now with,
It's such a difficult question. It'd be fun
yeah,
to have some engagement on this. So
yeah,
excellent.
feminism and toxic masculinity and all these hard things. So that'd be great. But yeah, feel free to yeah, like below, comment below, hit that subscribe button. Check out Daniel's website, colorofthoughts.com, and his
Yep.
podcast. And yeah, feel free to shoot us an email with any questions or even video topics. That would be great. But thank you everyone for watching. God bless.